So we're going to keep reading the 9th chapter of The Curse of the Blue Figurine by John Bellairs. Where we're at now, Johnny has been hypnotized. He confessed everything that had been going on to the hypnotist. And we got an indication that Professor Childermass does believe in ghosts and the hypnotist does not. But they're kind of double teaming on Johnny and saying, you know what? What you saw was hallucinations. And they got the ring off of him, too. So, we'll pick up from there. And so it went, hour after hour of this sort of thing. Johnny was beginning to have doubts about what he had seen and heard. He was still not entirely convinced, but he did have doubts. To tell the truth, he wanted to have doubts. Father Bart was imaginary. That meant that he was not being threatened with death and destruction. On the other hand, the whole experience had been so real, so very real, Johnny's mind began to whirl. Nothing made sense anymore. Was Dr. Melkonian real? Was the professor real? Was anything real? After the session in Dr. Melkonian's office, Johnny rode home to Dustin Heights in the professor's car. On the way, the professor asked Johnny if he would like to go on a little trip with him after school was over. He explained that they were going up into the White Mountains to sightsee and hike around and maybe even do a little mountain climbing. Johnny was delighted by this idea. He had seen pictures of the White Mountains of New Hampshire, but he had never actually been up there on a visit. The trip sounded great, but now his mind shifted to a totally different subject. What was he going to do about the meeting that he was supposed to have or wasn't supposed to have with Mr. Beard in Dunstan Park next Friday night? The professor, glancing sideways, saw the look on Johnny's face, and he read his thoughts. "Are you worried about your midnight rendezvous?" he asked with a slight smile. Johnny nodded glumly. "Yeah. What do you think I ought to do?" The professor's smile got broader and more confident. "Dr. Melkonian and I discussed this," he said briskly, "and we think that you should keep this so-called appointment. I'll go with you. And if a ghost shows up, well, I've always kind of had a hankering to see one. Are you game? Are you still willing to go?" Johnny nodded, and so that was settled. When they got back to Fillmore Street, the professor had a little talk with the Dixons. He explained to them as well as he could what Dr. Melkonian had said about Johnny and his problems. They were suspicious because they didn't like psychiatrists. They thought psychiatrists were like witch doctors, and they also thought that only crazy people believed in things that psychiatrists said. But they were glad to hear that Johnny was not seriously ill or ready for the insane asylum, and they thought that the trip to the White Mountains was really a very wonderful idea. Several days passed. One afternoon when the Dixons were out shopping, the professor sneaked over and took away the blue figurine and the hollow book that held it. He had told Johnny that he was going to do this, and Johnny agreed that it was probably a good idea. Meanwhile, Johnny went about his usual routine. He felt much, much better than he had felt in a long time. He slept soundly at night, and he did not hear any strange noises. He felt as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Naturally, he was still a bit worried about Friday night. He did not know what was going to happen, not really. But he reminded himself the ring was gone from his finger, and he was still among the living. That was an encouraging thought, to say the least. Friday night came, and it was pouring rain outside. The professor, umbrella in hand, met Johnny at the front door of his house at 11:45. Off they went, through the wet and wind, and finally they arrived in Dunstan Park. They stood around by Hannah Duston's statue and waited. The street light burned placidly, and the bronze Hannah hovered as menacingly as ever. The rain pelted down and made a racket on the stiff cloth of the professor's umbrella. Across the street, the columned church loomed ghostly and white, thrusting its tall spine up into the night sky. Time passed. 15 minutes, half an hour, nobody came. The professor unbuttoned his raincoat, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out his watch. He glanced at it, sniffed, and looked around. "Well," he said dryly, "Shakespeare would say that this was a night when the sheeted dead might squeak and gibber in the streets. But they ain't out, and on a night like this I don't blame them. No, sir, I don't blame them at all." He put his watch back in his pocket and peered owlishly around. Then he folded his arms, leered jauntily, and began to whistle. It was an old tune, "The Ghost of John," and as he whistled it through once, he sang it softly. "Have you seen the ghost of John? Long white bones and the flesh all gone. Ooh, wouldn't it be chilly with no skin on?" Johnny was not in such a jolly mood. He would have liked to be, but he couldn't manage it. He was staring intently at the great mass of shadow on the right side of the Unitarian church. Mr. Beard had walked out of that darkness last Saturday night. Try as he might, Johnny just couldn't persuade himself that Mr. Beard was imaginary. Yet the professor had just told him that Mr. Beard didn't exist. Dr. Melconian had told him this, too. And now, here in the park, the professor was singing silly songs and making fun of ghostly fears. Johnny asked himself why he couldn't let go of his lingering fear and be cheerful, too. The rain kept pouring down. Now the winds began to blow, and Johnny felt rain slashing across his legs. A hard gust hit them, and the professor staggered sideways. "Drat!" growled the professor. As he pulled the umbrella back over their heads, he turned and looked at Johnny, who was still peering anxiously this way and that. "Look, John," he said in a more gentle tone, "we ought to be getting on home. Nothing is going to happen here, believe me. Nothing except that we might go to sleep on our feet. I'm an old geezer, and these late hours are not for the likes of me." He yawned hugely and flipped his hand against his mouth. "Let's head for home. How about it, eh? Are you with me?" Johnny nodded. They trotted off down the long sidewalk that ran diagonally across the little park. They paused at the curb, and a car whooshed past. Its taillights stained the pavements red. As they started across the street, Johnny glanced back one more time over his shoulder. Nobody there. Why couldn't he be calm? Why couldn't he heave a deep sigh of relief? Well, he couldn't. Johnny felt nothing but foreboding, the fear of someone who is waiting for something to happen. And that is the end of Chapter 9.